That's the first, second, or third order axons that are crossing. So for your DCML pathway, first order neuron comes into the cord. Peripheral process comes into the DRG, where you find the cell body. Central process passes through the dorsal root into the spinal cord. And it may have a collateral that synapses in the dorsal horn. But the primary axon, instead of synapsing in the spinal gray, continues up to the brainstem. And that's where you find that first synapse between the first and second order neurons. Nucleus gracilis, if the input is coming from the lower limbs. Cuneatus, if it's upper. So then you've got the cell bodies of your second order neurons forming these nuclei. The axons immediately cross over. What's another word for crossover? They decussate immediately, meaning at the same level as nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, before ascending. When they ascend and go through the rest of the midbrain, they end up forming the medial lemniscus. And that takes these axons all the way to the thalamus, where they synapse on the third order neurons. So the cell bodies of third order neurons are forming the nuclei of the thalamus. And then the axons pass out through the internal capsule, then corona radiata, before reaching the somatosensory cortex. So you've got discriminative touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception. And then which pathway carries crude touch, pain, and temp? Anterolateral pathway. Okay, so we'll look at that one. But first, the spinocerebellar pathway, since that's the next one on the study guide, provides proprioceptive input from trunk and lower limbs to the cerebellum. So what about the upper limbs? Well, there's another pathway. Provides proprioceptive input from the neck and upper limbs, but it's not a pathway we're covering. So for the spinocerebellar tracts, you have ventral and dorsal. There's two of them. One crosses over, one doesn't. So your first order neurons come in, synapse in the spinal gray. That's where you find the cell bodies of your second order neurons. If the second order neuron decussates before ascending through the cord, then its axon, along with others, bundled together, will form the anterior spinocerebellar tract. For the second order neurons that do not cross over, that remain ipsilateral, meaning they stay on the same side, those axons, all bundled together, form the posterior spinocerebellar tract. Both anterior and posterior head to the cerebellar cortex. So one decussates, one does not. For the one that decussates, is it the first or second order neuron that's doing the decussating, the crossing over? It's the second order neuron. And are those associated with the ventral or dorsal spinocerebellar tract, the ones that do cross over? Ventral or anterior. And there's a little note there to remind you. Second order fibers decussate before ascending via ventral spinocerebellar tract. There is no crossing over for the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Two neuron pathway. Thalamus not involved. This information is going to the somatosensory cortex in another pathway. This pathway is just to provide the cerebellum with proprioceptive information. And what the cerebellum does with this is compares what is actually happening during a complex motor task to what is supposed to happen. And how does the cerebellum know what is supposed to be happening? What is it receiving? signals coming down from the upper motor neurons. So collaterals from those upper motor neurons go through the cerebellar peduncles into the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is receiving the same signals that the lower motor neurons are receiving. So it knows what's supposed to happen. Which muscles, how much force, the sequence, all of that. So it's comparing that to what's actually happening. And the information regarding what's actually happening is coming from proprioceptors, receptors in the muscles, receptors in the joints. So we know how much the muscle is lengthening, how quickly it's lengthening, how much the joint angle is changing, how quickly it's changing. And in the moment, while you're actually performing that motor task, corrections can be made. So the cerebellum is doing this very, very quickly. Next is anterolateral pathway. Carries pain, temp, crude touch. So we're back to a 3-neuron pathway, because this one ultimately ends in the cerebral cortex, so that we can become aware of these sensations. So we have 2 examples. Temperature information coming from the lower limb, pain information coming from the upper limb. For the temperature information, comes in through the first order neuron. That neuron synapses in the dorsal horn, where you have the cell bodies of second. Notice that the second order neuron crosses over before ascending. It ascends through the lateral spinothalamic tract all the way to the thalamus. And the name of that tract within this whole pathway tells you that. From the spinal cord to the thalamus. Now if you look at pain information coming in from the upper limb, first order neuron does the same thing. Comes in, synapses in the dorsal horn. That second order neuron crosses over immediately and ascends up the lateral spinothalamic tract. And then you can see the third order neuron, which is in the thalamus. Its axons come out of the thalamus, pass through the internal capsule, and then the corona radiata to get to the cerebral cortex. So the lateral spinothalamic tract, which is the one we're looking at in this slide, it provides pain and temp information to the cerebral cortex. Okay, but then you also have a ventral spinothalamic tract. This is the one that provides crude touch. First order neuron comes in, synapses on second. Just like the previous tract we looked at, the second crosses over immediately before ascending, except this time instead of ascending through the lateral spinothalamic tract, it ascends through the anterior spinothalamic tract, or ventral spinothalamic tract, which does the same thing as the lateral. Takes your second order neurons all the way to the thalamus. Right, so one pathway, anterolateral pathway, but it's divided into 2 tracts. And the name of the pathway tells you that, anterolateral. You have an anterior or ventral spinothalamic tract and a lateral spinothalamic tract. Everything is the same, the crossing over, number of neurons. The only difference is the lateral is for pain and temp, the ventral is for crude touch. And if you want to see one image that shows both of those tracts together, go back to slide 13, which shows all of the pathways. All the motor in red, sensory in blue. And here's your ventral spinothalamic tract and the lateral spinothalamic tract. We can skip the visceral pathways, not testing you on those. So we'll move on to descending, or efferent tracts. So now is this motor or sensory? Descending is motor, ascending is sensory. For descending motor pathways, there's basically 2 types. One that provides voluntary control over skeletal muscles, and the rest, which provide involuntary control over skeletal muscles. The one that provides voluntary control has 3 different names. What we've been calling it since chapter 9, corticospinal tract. Also known as pyramidal pathway. Also known as direct pathway. Direct implies voluntary control. You have direct control over the skeletal muscles using the direct pathway. And this pathway is a 2-neuron pathway. Upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. If the muscle that we're controlling is in the head or neck, then the cell body of the lower motor neuron is in the brainstem. It's in brainstem nuclei. And then the axon of the lower motor neuron is going to use a cranial nerve to reach that muscle. For example, which cranial nerve provides control over extrinsic eye muscles?
4,
Oculomotor,
6,
trochlear,
3.
abducens. 3, 4, 6. Which cranial nerve provides voluntary control over chewing muscles? Trigeminal, number 5. Facial muscles for facial expression.
7.
Facial nerve, 7. Neck muscles like sternocleidomastoid. Accessory, cranial nerve 11. But if we're controlling skeletal muscles below the head and neck, then the cell bodies are in the spinal gray, and the axons of the lower motor neurons pass through spinal nerves. We can be more specific, though. The cell bodies of lower motor neurons are in the spinal gray. Where exactly? What area? We have 3 horns that we divide the spinal gray into. So anterior or ventral horn. And then within each horn, we have named nuclei. So what is the nucleus of the ventral horn? Somatic motor nucleus. And then what this image is comparing this to, the somatic motor system, is comparing it to the autonomic. For autonomic, the purple, bluish purple, this is the equivalent of your upper motor neuron. It's contained within the CNS. But then these two together are the equivalent of this lower motor neuron. It only takes one lower motor neuron to get from the CNS to the skeletal muscle. But for the autonomic system, it takes 2. A preganglionic and a postganglionic, sympathetic or parasympathetic fiber. What type, and this is looking at a classification of axons, what type of nerve fiber or axon forms the preganglionic neuron? Type A, type B, or type C? Type B. So are these preganglionics myelinated or unmyelinated?
Myelinated.
Lightly myelinated. And then the postganglionics are type C, which is unmyelinated. So when these guys are grouped together, they form white matter, because they're myelinated. And these guys all bundled together forms gray matter. So in chapter 13, we'll look at rami communicantes. I'll show that to you real quick. So you've got these 2 branches side by side right here. Those are rami communicantes. That's what these 2 little things are here. And one is called the white ramus, and the other is called the gray ramus. So the white ramus is white because it contains type B fibers, preganglionics. The gray ramus is gray because it contains type C, unmyelinated axons, postganglionics. So we'll talk more about autonomic in chapter 14. Let's move on to the pathways. All right, so first, corticospinal, aka pyramidal, aka direct. Two neuron pathway, upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. Where does the pathway begin? Cortico, cerebral cortex. Where does it end?
Receptors.
The spinal cord. Where in the spinal cord?
Ventral.
Ventral horn. Somatic motor nucleus. So really what we're looking at is the axon of the upper motor neuron. This is really long. Primary motor cortex, corona radiata, internal capsule, cerebral peduncles, deep pons, pyramids of the medulla. At the pyramids, 85% of the corticospinal tract fibers cross over. So that's the purple one. When they cross over and enter the cord, they're entering and forming the lateral corticospinal tract. That 15% that don't cross over at the medulla continue down the same side. In other words, they remain ipsilateral, while the purple ones are contralateral. And the ipsilateral neurons, they form the ventral corticospinal tract. Now it does eventually cross over, but not until you get all the way down to the level of the lower motor neuron. And there it crosses over at the very last second. Ignore the little interneuron in here, by the way, because it'll mess up that whole two-neuron pathway. It's going to look like there's more than two. There's really not. Ignore that guy. So the upper motor neuron is going to synapse on the lower motor neuron. So the whole pathway, corticospinal pathway, pyramidal pathway, direct pathway, includes two tracts, ventral corticospinal tract, lateral corticospinal tract. 85% of the upper motor neurons pass down the ventral corticospinal tract. Sorry, pass down the lateral corticospinal tract. That's the one that decussates at the level of the medulla. Remaining 15% ventral corticospinal tract, they decussate down in the spinal cord. Not until they actually reach that lower motor neuron in the crossover at the last second. Different book, same pathway. Starting at the primary motor cortex. And because they have the homunculus here, the somatotopic map, you could say, well, if it's coming from the foot, it starts over here. Goes through corona radiata, internal capsule, cerebral peduncle, deep pons, pyramids of the medulla, 85% crossing over at the decussation, continuing down the spinal cord in the lateral corticospinal tract, while 15% remain ipsilateral. They continue down the anterior or ventral corticospinal tract, and then cross over at the last second. You can always go back to slide 13, which shows you all the sensory and all the motor tracts. And here you have lateral corticospinal and ventral corticospinal. Everything else is extrapyramidal or indirect. Reticulospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, tectospinal tract. The names tell you where they begin. Where does the rubrospinal tract originate? Where are the cell bodies of those upper motor neurons? So rubro is Latin for red, and there's only one red structure we talked about, the red nucleus, which is found in the midbrain. So that's where the upper motor neurons originate. Now, as far as function, if voluntary control comes solely from the corticospinal pathway, then everything else must be some form of involuntary, subconscious control. So if you look at these extrapyramidal pathways, There's four we're looking at: vestibulospinal, tectospinal, reticulospinal, rubrospinal, subconscious, 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 subconscious. Right? All involuntary. What does vestibulo refer to? So in the ear, you have the vestibular apparatus, which provides one of the 5 special senses, that of equilibrium or balance. That information goes to the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem. Well, that's where this pathway originates, vestibular nuclei. And then from there, those upper motor neurons head down the cord, synapse with the lower motor neurons to control the skeletal muscles, but control them subconsciously. Now, given that this is coming from the vestibular nuclei, this subconscious regulation of muscle must have something to do with balance and equilibrium, and it does. Subconscious regulation of balance. And muscle tone associated with balance. So if I'm just standing and you're just sitting, we don't want to have to think about which muscles to contract to keep us in that position. We just want to sit or stand. So all of the regulation is happening subconsciously, involuntarily. So if my head starts to sway to the left, or forward, or backward, and therefore my whole body is moving forward, backward, side to side, the vestibular apparatus will detect that. It will provide input to the vestibular nuclei. And there, motor signals will go out to the appropriate muscles to counter whatever that movement is. So if we're starting to fall back, muscles will contract and bring us back forward, right? Just keeping us, upright. Rubrospinal tract. This one we have a picture of. The other 3 we don't. But it starts at the red nucleus in the midbrain. You can see that the upper motor neuron crosses over immediately. Heads down, contralateral side of the spinal cord to meet up with the lower motor neuron. And again, you can ignore this little interneuron. And then as far as function, subconscious regulation of upper limb muscle tone and movement. So the rubrospinal tract would be involved in locomotion, for example. Right? So when you're walking, those repeated arm swings, part of that is coming from the rubrospinal tract. How about reticulospinal tract? Reticular, there's one structure we talked about in the brain that has reticular in its name. The reticular formation, that loose collection of cell bodies, of nuclei scattered throughout all 3 parts of the brainstem. It has lots of functions, including some motor functions. Subconscious regulation of reflex activity. So that's very general. But then we can get really specific with the tectospinal tract. Where do you find the tectum?
Midbrain.
So the word means roof of midbrain. The tectum is the roof of the midbrain. Well, really, what does that whole section of the midbrain include? What does it consist of? Just 4 big bodies, right? Corpora quadrigemina is the tectum. So tectum is a regional term. But specifically, those bodies found in the tectum represent collectively the corpora quadrigemina. And then specifically the top 2, the superior colliculi, what are they involved in? Visual reflexes. And then the bottom 2, inferior colliculi, auditory reflexes. So then you look at the function of the tectospinal tract. Subconscious regulation of eye, head, neck, upper limb position in response to visual from the superior colliculus and auditory from the inferior colliculus. Stimulant. Makes perfect sense. So that startle reflex, right? When you hear a loud sound off in the distance, your response is to turn towards it to see what it is. So for these 3 pathways, tectospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, you don't need to know the anatomy. We don't have pictures of those. Just the names, where those upper motor neurons originate, which is provided in the name of the pathway, and the function, which all has to do with subconscious, involuntary control. Right? So tectospinal, tectum, vestibulospinal, vestibular nuclei, reticulospinal, reticular formation. The name really does tell you where it originates. And of course, rubrospinal tract, red nucleus. As we typically do, I'll leave the disorders for you to look over. You can read about them in the book. I'll just go over a couple things with you. Now, lesion, remember, is any form of damage. It could be from pressure, lack of blood flow, a cut through the spinal cord. And if you have a ventral lesion, if you cut through the ventral half of the spinal cord, what function are you going to lose completely?
Somatic motor.
It can be, general. Motor or sensory? Let's start there. A cut through the ventral half of the cord will damage not only the ventral white matter, but the ventral gray matter. And in those ventral horns are all of your lower motor neurons, somatic lower motor neurons. Now, as far as the white matter, it isn't separated into sensory and motor. We can't say all the ventral white matter contains only motor pathways and dorsal white matter, sensory. You can see that they're mixed. Red is motor, and it's everywhere. Blue is sensory, it's everywhere. So when you have a cut through the ventral cord, you're not only going to lose motor, you're going to lose some sensory function as well, because there are some sensory pathways in there. And when you cut through the dorsal half of the cord, you're not only going to lose sensory, you're going to lose a little bit of motor because there are some motor pathways in there as well. But we're focusing on the more obvious, meaning ventral lesion, motor loss. Dorsal lesion, sensory loss. Okay, we're not going to look at the potential sensory pathways affected by the ventral lesion or the motor pathways affected by the dorsal lesion. So we're really focusing on the gray matter. Difference between flaccid paralysis and spastic. Flaccid paralysis, no motor signals of any kind reaching the muscle. Not voluntary, not involuntary. So what happens to the muscle? No stimulation, no muscle tone, big time atrophy. Spastic paralysis. This means you've lost voluntary control, but perhaps there are still some extrapyramidal pathways intact, providing involuntary subconscious control. If that's the case, you might be able to hold your body position in a standing or seated position, right? Because the postural muscles keeping you upright are controlled involuntarily. But what you wouldn't be able to do is move, right? Just like get up and walk or move your arm. But you could potentially maintain some amount of body position. And then maybe some reflexes would still be intact, like maybe the startle reflex. Right? If the tectospinal tract is intact, well then if you hear a loud sound, your head will turn. But can you turn your head voluntarily? No. It'd be kind of weird, right? For the muscles to work somewhat involuntarily, but no voluntary.
So your head would turn, but you wouldn't be able to turn it back.
Good question. I don't know if it goes back on its own or not. Yeah, you might be stuck on it then. That's if you have control over the upper, right? Consequence of a ventral transection below T12. So now we're getting specific as to which sensory or motor function is lost. So if it's a ventral transection, is this sensory or motor that we're talking about? Motor. And if it's below T12, what is intact? Upper body. Right? So if the cut is below T12, you have not damaged the cervical enlargement, in which case the upper limbs are fine. But the lumbar enlargement is below T12. Right? So signals are not going past the transection. So no control over lower limbs. What if it's below C1? Right? So the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement affected. No control over upper or lower limbs. depending on exactly where in the cervical region of the spinal cord the damage is, you may not have control over the breathing muscles. May have to be put on a ventilator. The last item on there, spina bifida. I just happen to have a slide of one type of spina bifida. Spina bifida cystica. So with spina bifida, you typically have some form of incomplete vertebral arch formation. And remember, it's really the vertebral arches that surround and protect the cord, so the cord is more exposed. And in this case, what's happened is meninges and CSF have filled this giant cyst. So it's not just fluid in there, there's meninges in there as well, which is called the meningeocele. And it would be dangerous to try to remove this because the cord is more or less exposed underneath. Lab exam. I sent out a test prep email, I think it was last Friday. It's covering chapters 11, 12, and part 1 of chapter 13. Chapter 13 study guides are by the clickers. So what I did here is I just quickly flipped through those pages of chapter 13, part 1, and looked at the major anatomy topics. So I think like on the second page of the study guide, you see a bunch of underlying terms. Those are all general senses receptors. We don't have models, so that's picture only. And then a little bit further in the study guide, we get into the anatomy of nerves. That's pictures only. We don't have a nerve model. And then cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and the nerve plexuses formed from the spinal nerves. Those we have models of, so models and pictures. There's very little function questions on the lab exam, and this is all in the test prep email. Any function questions are going to come from the cranial nerves, and I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I may ask you if it's sensory, motor, or a mixed cranial nerve. And I may also ask you what it innervates. And what it innervates, of course, is connected to the function. Like optic nerve provides visual information by innervating what? The eye. Right? Or if you want to be more specific, what part of the eye contains photoreceptors? So you could say it innervates the retina. But eye is fine. For trochlear, you need to know the name, but also the number, cranial nerve 4. And is that motor, sensory, or mixed? Trochlear. It is motor, just motor. And then what does it innervate? That is, is it providing motor signals to? The superior oblique, right? One of the extrinsic eye muscles, superior oblique. So pretty straightforward. In fact, on the lab exam itself, I don't have a bunch of extra lines for you to give me all this function information. It's always just one line, so I'm not looking for a ton. In chapter 13, there are some spinal nerves, peripheral nerves really is a better term, that you need to know. And many of them are coming from, I think all of them actually, are coming from chapter 10, from your muscle list. You know, the innervations. Nerves like femoral, sciatic, radial, ulnar, median, musculocutaneous, tibial, common fibular, phrenic. I think those might be all of them actually right there. And you need to know the nerve plexuses that those nerves originate from. So also in chapter 13, we look at the ventral rami, extending from each cord segment, and whether or not those rami form a plexus. If they do, you need to know the name. You have the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, sacral plexus. You need to know which ventral rami form each of those plexuses. For example, ventral rami C1 through C5 form the cervical plexus, as an example. I'll just show it to you real quick. So what we cover in chapter 12 is the ventral root, the dorsal root, and how they fuse together to form the spinal nerve. And that's where we left it. But on this model, they take it just a little bit further so you can see what happens when that spinal nerve branches. And it does immediately, which is why sciatic, tibial, and radial nerves, they aren't really spinal nerves. We call them spinal nerves. We're using that term loosely in that context. Technically, this is a spinal nerve. Just a very, very short segment, starting where the two roots fuse together, the ventral and the dorsal, and ending as soon as it branches. So the main branch, what really can be thought of as a continuation of the spinal nerve, is the ventral ramus. And that's what is really heading out into the periphery, the ventral rami. And some of those ventral rami intermix. So that means nerve fibers from this ramus may go into another ramus nearby, maybe below, maybe above, and you get like 4, 5, 6 different rami, all in a line, like C1, C2, C3, C4, C5. And they all kind of intermix, and they form a network or a plexus. But in addition to the ventral ramus, you have a dorsal ramus. And then you have these two smaller ones called rami communicantes. And that's all on the model. So this big one here is ventral ramus. This small one in the back, dorsal ramus. And these two in the front, rami communicantes. So spinal nerve technically is just this little piece. That's it. So here's an example of that intermixing. These are all ventral rami, C1 through C5, and the fibers are all mixing together. So you end up with a nerve that has nerve fibers coming from 5 different ventral rami. Now there's a lot of nerves that come off of each plexus. But I am so nice that for this plexus, you only need to know one. The phrenic nerve. You are so welcome. And I do that for all of them. Brachial plexus, you need to know the easiest ones. The one along the radius, the one along the ulna, the one between the radius and ulna, and the one that goes out on the periphery to the skin. Musculocutaneous, radial, median, and ulnar. Lumbar plexus. So you need to know the ventral rami that form each plexus. So this would be L1 through L5. And the only one you need to know, femoral. Sacral plexus, L5 to S5. You need to know sciatic, but also the 2 branches of it. So sciatic comes down the back of the thigh. Just above the knee it splits. The continuation of sciatic is tibial. Continue straight down the back of the leg, along the tibia. And then the branch that heads off to the side, to the lateral leg, common fibula. So those 3 you need to know from sacral plexus. So just kind of going backwards. So you've got the nerve plexuses, the spinal nerves, and related rami. So that would be like here. Ventral root, dorsal root, spinal nerve, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, rami communicantes coming off of it. We have a model that's very similar to this image. It's right here. So both of these cover all of the plexuses and most of the nerves that extend from those plexuses. Right, so from this one we can see sciatic, femoral, ulnar radial, median, musculocutaneous. Same thing on here. Yeah, phrenic as well. And anatomy of a nerve. This is a pretty good overview right here. It's pretty easy because it's kind of like a muscle. Just like a muscle can be divided into fascicles, so can a nerve. And just like the muscle is surrounded by epimysium, the nerve is surrounded by epineurium. A muscle fascicle is surrounded by perimysium. A nerve fascicle is surrounded by perineurium. A muscle fiber is surrounded by endomysium. A nerve fiber, which means an axon, is surrounded by endoneurium. Not too bad. And then the receptors. These are all the receptors that you need to be able to identify. No models, just pictures. No, the only functional stuff is cranial nerves and nerve plexuses. Everything else is straight labeling. And then I gave you the breakdown of the exam in the test prep email. You have, what, 50-ish clicker questions? They're all multiple choice. I think they're all labeling as well. So I'm pretty sure the few function questions I ask are on the stations portion. So how about rest of class working with models? So I can do with everybody what I did with some of you on Saturday, and basically go through every model.